It's my particular pleasure to welcome members of our Board of Trustees here this evening. The board, our wonderful board, will be here for the next couple of days. I also want to offer special thanks to RTI and the Research Triangle Foundation, whose support of the National Humanities Center helps to make public events like this evening possible. For those of you who are here for the first time or who haven't been here for a while, please make sure you register at the front desk on your way out tonight so we have your email and we can keep you aware of the various public events that we have during the course of the year. We also want to thank Sharon Wheeler from Purple Crow Booksellers in Hillsborough, who is here tonight. And Lee Smith will be selling Lee's books, and Lee will be signing books after the reading tonight. Lee Smith grew up in a coal mining town in the mountains of Appalachia and started writing at an early age, selling her imaginative stories to neighbors for a nickel apiece when she was only 9 years old. Her very first story involved Adlai Stevenson and Jane Russell heading west in a covered wagon to become Mormons. And, she says, the themes addressed in that early piece have remained a focus of her work ever since. Concerns about faith, a deep sense of place, and the desire to escape the bonds imposed on us by the outside world. That desire to defy limits, whether they are geographic or socially prescribed, quickly became evident when Lee enrolled at Hollins College in Roanoke. It was there that she and another future novelist, Annie Dillard, became go-go dancers for an all-girl rock band, the Virginia Wolves, and also where she and a group of friends decided to spend part of a summer riding a giant raft down the Mississippi River in homage to Huckleberry Finn. It was also at Hollins during her senior year that Lee Smith submitted an early draft of a coming-of-age novel to a Book of the Month Club contest and was awarded one of 12 fellowships. 2 years later, in 1968, that novel, The Last Day the Dog Bushes Bloomed, became her first published work of fiction. Since then, she's published over a dozen more novels and 4 collections of short stories and received countless accolades as one of the most celebrated writers of her generation. Her awards, which are too numerous to list, include the Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award, the Robert Penn Warren Prize for Fiction, the Weatherford Award for Appalachian Literature, the North Carolina Award for Fiction, the Sir Walter Raleigh Award, the O. Henry Award for Short Fiction, and in 2009 she was inducted into the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. While she has made a career as a novelist, Lee has also been a news reporter for the Tuscaloosa News. She taught English at the Harpeth Hall School in Nashville and locally at the Carolina Friends School, and taught creative writing at both Duke and UNC Chapel Hill. In 1981, she joined the English department at North Carolina State University as an assistant professor of English, and later became the director of NC State's creative writing program. She served as writer-in-residence and director of creative writing for many years at NC State until she retired and was made professor emerita in 2000. In 2016, Lee published her first full-length work of nonfiction, Dimestore, A Writer's Life, a memoir that traces her experiences as a writer, beginning with the hours she spent absorbing local voices and hearing tales of Southern storytellers in her father's store in Grundy, Virginia. This entertaining, insightful, and poignantly moving work brings us into the essence of what it means to live a writer's life. In it, Lee takes us for a walk in the woods and reveals that she's, quote, realizing that writing is not about fame or even publication. It's not about exalted language, abstract themes, or the escapades of glamorous people. It is about our own real world and our own real lives and understanding what happens to us day by day. It's about playing with children and listening to old people. Writing itself is an inherently therapeutic activity, she writes. Writing cannot bring our loved ones back, but it can sometimes fix them in our fleeting memories as they were in life, and can always help us make it through the night. To help you make it through the night, it's my honor and pleasure to invite you to listen to a North Carolina treasure. Please welcome to the National Humanities Center, Lee Smith.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. I feel like I should just leave now. But I am going to read to you a little bit from my only work of nonfiction. It's very bizarre for me to have done this at all, I think. But this is a little book named Dimestore, and I'll just talk about it a little bit, I guess. It's my own kind of hillbilly elegy. I know you've all read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, and I'd love to talk about that too. But it's true that all over America, the death of the small town, all their little hometowns of the heart, is happening, of the main street with its string of family-owned stores. And it's dying downtown. So this book is a love song. It's an elegy. It's mostly a love song for small town America and its way of life, for the family store, the big extended family, and the kind of free, unfettered childhood I had, running all over town and then up in the mountain until they rang the big bell to call us home for supper. A place where Twitter meant the sound of birds. I was spurred on to write this book. I mean, I think we all lose our little hometowns of the heart, but usually we lose them gradually as we move away and they change and so on. But for me, this was unfortunately very dramatic because I had moved down to North Carolina, but my parents had still stayed up in Grundy, Virginia, Daddy to run his dime store. And then the whole town became, before my very eyes, a ghost town. Daddy closed his dime store due to lack of business. This was because of the death of the coal business. I mean, it was because of coal in one way, by 1980, 40% of the population of the county had left. It was also due to mountaintop removal and strip mining before it, and so on. So people were just having to leave to get a job and so on. And so the whole downtown was a ghost town. And then they got this idea and they got a grant to sort of move the town, the higher ground, and, the town that was there was going to be, the river was going to be widened and, everything, and there was going to be a ring wall and all this. And so basically they were going to blow up the whole downtown as it existed. My father's dime store, which he'd owned for 50 years, the home that my parents had never had another house, they built it, and it was there on the river. And so I got this job. I mean, I got this, assignment from the Washington Post to go up there and write about it. So I was there when they blew up the dime store and 55 other businesses that had been on the main street. And this was my father's whole life. He'd owned and ran that store for almost 60 years. And so I was there for that. I wrote about it. For the Washington Post. And then I just couldn't, but it was so much more emotional than I could have imagined. I couldn't stand to be there when they blew up my parents' house, which, as I said, they built the only house they ever had. And I knew when it was bulldozed, actually. I knew when that was going to happen, and I just couldn't go. So I didn't go. And then a week later, I get this FedEx package in Hillsborough, North Carolina. And it's this beautiful, it turned out that all their former neighbors and people from town had gone over just before the big bulldozer went in and taken the door knocker off of my parents' door. And it was an S, it was a big S, brass. And they'd taken it, and one of the neighbors who had a hobby of woodworking had made this beautiful shadow frame and put the S in it, and they had mailed it to me in Hillsborough. So I opened this box, and I just burst into tears and cry for 3 days until my husband is saying, I think you need to see somebody, whatever, And then I finally quit crying and started writing nonfiction for the first time in my life, because I just wanted to fix in my memory all those wonderful people and the places where they had lived and had their being as I had known them, all these years. So I wrote some nonfiction, and here it is. And it was particularly helpful to me to do this because I have to say all our family photographs had been lost in flood after flood, because not only the Dimestore but the family home had been flooded 3 times. And so, this is why they widened the river and did all this stuff. Anyway, okay, so this is, as I say, an elegy to the small town America, all their little hometowns of the heart, as my next door neighbor Alan Gerganis has said, to Main Street with its string of family-owned stores, and to the family store, the big extended families we all had. And I think it's just, it's larger than our little town, because these ghost towns are all over America, whether they're copper mine towns out west or textile mill towns, so, along between North Carolina and Virginia, or copper mine towns, or, little tobacco towns that no longer exist. So anyway, so I wrote this book, and all right, I'm just gonna read a little bit about it. It also turns out, because I've been a writer all my life, it turns out to be a book about writing. And I think the kind of writer I am is not so much a writer. As my friend Lucinda McKeithen said once, I'm not a writerly writer. I'm a storyteller, and there's a big difference, but that's because of how I first heard language. And so anyway, let me read a little bit about, this is where the stories came from. Okay, so I'm read a little bit about where the stories came from. First, we have the Dimestore. Many of my favorite memories of Grundy take place in the Dimestore. As a little girl, my job was taking care of the dolls. Not only did I comb their hair and fluff up their frocks, but I also made up long, complicated life stories for them. Things that had happened to them before they got to the Dimestore, and things that would happen to them after they left my care. I gave each of them 3-part names, because all the girls and women in my family had 3 names. Like my name was Lee Marshall Smith until I went off to college and dropped Marshall. But anyway, so I gave each of the dolls 3-part names. Mary Elizabeth Satterfield, for instance, for a very fancy doll, and Baby Betsy Black for a baby doll. Their lives were very dramatic. Upstairs in my father's office, I got to type on a typewriter, count money, and talk to Roberta Ratliff, pale, blonde, and pretty as a princess in a fairy tale book. That last year, when I had a book tour for this book, Roberta Ratliff came, brought by her family. She was 102, sharp as a tack. I spent hours and hours upstairs in the office, observing the whole floor of the Dimestore through the one-way glass window and reveling in my own power. Nobody can see me, but I can see everybody. I witnessed not only shoplifting, but fights and embraces as well. I remember one time it was Christmas and I was looking out at the dimes, looking down, and I saw this big old woman come in a big old coat. And, radios used to be big then. This was a big old Philco radio. And she got the radio and put it between her legs like this under the coat and just waddled out of the store. And for some reason, I didn't tell. I didn't tell on her. I got real obsessed with whether she was going to make it or not. And she made it. And I never told my daddy, and I would never be here right now telling you this if he were still alive. Anyway, up in that office, I learned the position of the omniscient narrator who sees and records everything, yet is never visible. It was the perfect early education for a fiction writer. I always went to check on the goldfish in their basement tank. And every spring I looked forward to the arrival of the pastel-colored Easter chickens. But my favorites were these little round turtles with roses painted on their shells. I used to wear these turtles to school. They would cling to my sweaters like brooches, and everyone wanted to wear one of my turtles. That was very popular. Okay, so I went to town. Every single day when school let out. I went to town from school across the swinging bridge. And first I went to the Dimestore and got some candy and did my homework upstairs in the office. And then later I would cross the street to the old stone courthouse and do some of my homework in my granddaddy's treasurer's office, where he had been the treasurer for 60 years. I would be eavesdropping all the while. Talking to the girls in the Dimestore, I learned who was pregnant and wished she wasn't, who was getting married, who had got saved, who had got churched for drinking, because these were the kind of days when they would call you out from the pulpit if you've been seen drunk or walking drunk, whatever that means, who was mean to her children or made the best red velvet cake in the county. Over in the courthouse, I'd hear a different kind of story. Who was in jail, who had gone bankrupt or shot his brother or tried to short his employees on pay, who was out of a job or had set his house on fire just to collect the insurance money. Then, another place where I heard the stories was at my grandmother's house. We had a big family potluck every Sunday afternoon. So the whole family came over on Sunday afternoons. Most of the men were in politics, yellow dog Democrats. You know what that means? That means you would vote for a yellow dog before you'd vote for a Republican, which I still agree with. Anyway, most of the men were in politics. Yellow dog Democrats always running somebody for office or politicking and agitating about something. They were all big talkers. They'd drink some whiskey out behind the house in the barn because my grandmother wouldn't let anybody drink in the house. And after a while, they would bet good money on just about anything. Even which bird would fly first off the telephone wire. And then everybody would stay out on the porch talking and telling stories until it got dark. And we could all see the fairy lights of the Morgan Theater. We said theater. The Morgan Theater's marquee over in town across Slate Creek. I usually fell asleep on somebody's lap, looking at those lights and hearing those stories told by somebody that loved me, so that my sense of a story is still, we used to stay in the mountains, still yet very personal. Even today, when I'm writing, stories come to me in a human voice. Often, it is the voice of a character, but sometimes it's the voice of the story itself. And then, I think the last place where I heard a different kind of story still was in Mama's kitchen. So, my mother had come from Chincoteague, Virginia, just as far as you can go to the eastern shore, from the western part of Virginia, where Grundy is, to the eastern shore of Virginia, and still be in the state. And she had met my father at a wedding, and they just fell completely in love. And he immediately went out there to Chincoteague Island to court her, and just took up residence with his courting. But unfortunately, she had graduated from college and gotten a job as a home economics teacher up in Pennsylvania. So she had to go and be a home economics teacher up in Pennsylvania. So he followed her up there and got a room in a boarding house. She had a room with the superintendent of schools, unfortunately. But he got a room in a boarding house and courted her, and every day he'd pick her up and he'd take her to school, and then after school he'd be waiting with a bouquet that he had gathered from somebody's garden. So soon the whole town took a fancy to this, as you can imagine, and they eloped right after the end of classes when Christmas vacation started. So they eloped. And she didn't ever go back to Pennsylvania. She went to Grundy, Virginia, where she was the home economics teacher, and lived, they had the same house, as I say, lived there forever and ever. I think it was only in writing, you learn a lot of things when you try to write nonfiction, because you write something down and you say, is that true? How do you know? Is that true? And anyway. But one thing I began to realize was how important my mother, the outsider, had been to my own writing, because she saw things that other people didn't see because they'd been right in the middle of them all the time, And I remember at her funeral, it's a kind of funeral where you have a lot of different preachers that come and preach, and then anybody who wants to can stand up and talk. And one old man stood up. Mama had taught home economics and history and a whole bunch of stuff. And this old man stood up and said, well, he said, I went to school to Miss Jig. She was Virginia Marshall Smith. Her nickname was Jig. So I went to school to Miss Jig. And I have to tell you one thing. She was a mighty fine woman for a foreigner. And my husband, Hal, who many of you know, was saying, what does he mean, a foreigner? She lived there for 60 years. And I said, yeah, but she wasn't born there. That's the whole thing. But I think now, in retrospect, having written this book, I understand that her being a foreigner was really important to me becoming a writer, because she saw all kinds of things. She noted things that people who had been there and known everything for years did not note. And she was also very funny. Anyway, so I'll read you a little bit about Mama, because I heard a completely different kind of story from my mother. When I think of Mama, she's always at home, holding forth in her kitchen, and somebody is always there visiting. The kitchen is filled with cigarette smoke, the smell of coffee perking, remember the percolator? And whatever's baking in the oven. Often it is Mama's famous loaf bread. The women lean forward over their coffee cups and lower their voices. Writing or drawing at my own little table in the corner, I perk right up. Now they are going to really talk about somebody who has just never been quite right, bless her heart. Or somebody who is kindly nervous. Or somebody else who's been having trouble down there. Down there is a secret place, a foreign country, like Mexico or Nicaragua. I keep on drawing and don't miss a word. Mama takes the loaf bread out of the oven and gives us all a piece, crusty on the outside and soft on the inside, with butter melting into it. It is the best thing in the world. Country music plays softly on the countertop radio, tuned to our brand new station, WNRG. G is for Grundy. In my mind, it's always Johnny Cash singing Ring of Fire. The Lavisa River flows out back with the railroad on the other side, carrying Norfolk and Western trains loaded with coal. How I loved the mournful whistle of those trains as they roared past several times a day. We'd run out and stand there on the riverbank watching them pass, wondering where they were going. On the edge of the riverbank sat the little writing house that my daddy built for me and then had to build back again after every flood. So I think that's kind of where the stories came from. But you know, for any writer, there's always who, you know, where you grew up, who you grew up around, how you first heard language, that is really important. And then, equally important, is the books you read, you know, the books you read. And so that is a huge thing. So I'm going to skip over a little bit to that. I think, let me skip to Hollins College. I went to school at Hollins College. Now it's at the Hollins University. And my professor there was Louis Rubin, a man whom many of you know. He later moved to Chapel Hill and started Algonquin Books. But he was my teacher. And Hollins College was one of the few places when I went there in 1964, I guess, that actually taught creative writing, and he started, I think, one of the first MFA programs. He had started one at Johns Hopkins before, in which two of his students were William Styron was one, and some other really famous person whom I can't remember right now. Anyway, this is named Marble Cake. Although I don't usually write, because I was determined to be a writer ever since I was a child. I had no idea what was involved, obviously. Although I don't usually write autobiographical fiction, the main character in one of my stories sounds suspiciously like the girl I used to be. And this is the character in the story, which was me. More than anything else in the world, I wanted to be a writer. I didn't want to learn to write, of course. I just wanted to be a writer. And often I pictured myself poised at the foggy edge of a cliff someplace in the south of France, wearing a cape, drawing furiously on a long, dark cigarette, hollow-cheeked and haunted. I had been romantically dedicated to the idea of being a writer ever since I could remember. I had started telling stories as soon as I could talk, true stories and made-up stories too. My father was fond of saying that I would climb a tree to tell a lie rather than stand on the ground and tell the truth. In fact, a lie was called a story in Southwest Virginia. There was no difference. And well do I remember being shaken until my teeth rattled with the stern admonition, "Don't you tell me no story now." But I couldn't help it. I got hooked on stories early. And as soon as I could write, I started writing them down. First on my mother's Crane stationery. Remember Crane stationery? It was sort of almost square and it had a little blue. My mother's address was just Mrs. Ernest L. Smith, Grundy, Virginia. No zip, no nothing. Anyway, I started writing them down first on my mother's Crane stationery when I was 9. Later in little books with covers I carefully made for them, pasting on pictures I'd cut out of magazines or catalogs or illustrating them myself. My first book was about, I think he mentioned it was about, we talked a lot about Adlai Stevenson in my family. We loved all Democrats. We loved Adlai Stevenson. And when he lost the election, I wrote him a letter and told him I was so sorry that he had lost an election. And he wrote me back, or somebody wrote me back. So I loved Adlai Stevenson. So when I started to write a book, my hero was Adlai Stevenson. That was the main character. And because I always went to the movies in Grundy, they were always Westerns. And every time it changed, I would go. And so I knew all about Jane Russell. So in this book, Adlai Stevenson is the main character, and he falls in love with Jane Russell. And they elope, and they go west in a covered wagon, where they marry and somehow become Mormons. And I knew about Mormons because one of them had come to our door, and nobody ever came to our door who didn't live in the county, and it was a big deal. So anyway, they got married and became Mormons. So I was, as a girl, I wrote my way through school, fueled by my voracious reading. I'd read anything: mysteries, romances, true crime, science fiction. The National Enquirer. My mother and I loved the National Enquirer, and we would buy them at the, we loved everything in them. We knew everything about the lives of the stars. We especially loved, when perfectly normal people are taken up into space, like that, where they are mysteriously given a physical examination. Do you remember that? It's like, oh no, I was just entranced. Anyway, finally, they sent me off to St. Catherine's School in Richmond, Virginia, which was something my mother knew about, and being from Eastern Virginia. I was the only person I knew who went away to school. I think they thought I was going to run off and marry my boyfriend, which I might have. It's true. Anyway, during my last 2 years of high school, I was gently but firmly guided into the classics, though my own fiction remained relentlessly sensational. At Hollins College, I wrote about stewardesses living in Hawaii, where I had never been, about orphans, evil twins, fashion models, and alternative universes, receiving B- and C+. And cryptic little comments from my professors, Lex Allen and Richard Dillard, that said basically, write what you know. I thought this was terrible advice. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know what I knew. All I knew was that I was not going to write anything about Grundy, Virginia, ever. That was for sure. My last glimpse of home, and because my daddy was going to take me over to Hollins College, but he never got home from the Dimestore when he said he was going to. So I was sitting on the porch with all my bags packed, and my mother and two of my aunts drinking iced tea and talking interminably about whether one of them ought to have a hysterectomy or not. Well, I was out of there. But I was still drunk on words and books, just as I'd been as a child, when I used to read under the covers with a flashlight all night long. My favorite professor at Hollins was Lewis Rubin, Jr., who introduced us to Southern literature. I had never heard of it. I didn't even know it existed when we started out. Actually, I think Lewis invented it. But I'd already gotten drunk on Faulkner a couple of times, and then had to go to the infirmary for a whole day when we read William Styron's Lie Down in Darkness. I got too wrought up, as my mother used to say. The nurse gave me a tranquilizer and made me lie down. Even so, I considered cutting class on the day that this woman with the funny name from Mississippi was coming to visit us. She was on campus, I believe, to receive the Hollins Medal, an honor undoubtedly engineered by Mr. Rubin, one of her earliest and greatest champions. But I had never heard of her, and it was so pretty outside, a great day to cut class and go up to Carvin's Cove and drink some beer and just stomp moodily around campus smoking cigarettes and acting like a writer. Also, I used to carry this guitar case around like I was a musician, but I didn't have a guitar. Carried this guitar case around when I was stomping moodily. Anyway, this was my plan until I ran into Lewis Rubin, unfortunately, in the campus post office. And then I had to go to class. There were a lot more people in that old, high-ceilinged classroom than we had ever had before, and some of them were male, a rarity at Hollins in those days. The seats in the back of the room were filling up fast with faculty from our own college and from other area colleges too. Guys with beards, leather patches on the elbows of their ratty sports jackets, not your dad, as well as graduate students from UVA and WNL. The graduate students needed haircuts and looked intense. In fact, they looked exactly like the fabled 60s, reputed to be happening somewhere outside our fairy tale Blue Ridge campus at that time. We'd heard of them. A ripple of anticipation ran through the room. Mr. Rubin was ushering Eudora Welty in. I was deeply disappointed. She certainly did not look like a writer. She didn't have a cape or boots or anything. What she wore was one of those nice lady linen dresses that button up the front, just like all the other nice ladies I had known in my whole life, just like my mother and all her friends. In fact, she looked a little bit like Miss Nellie Hart, my 8th grade English teacher. My favorite English teacher ever, but still, I lost interest immediately. I can't even remember what Mr. Rubin said when he introduced her. I was too busy stealing glances at the back of the room while appearing not to. Then Eudora Welty began to read A Worn Path out loud in her fast, light voice that seemed to sing along with the words of the story. And I was suddenly right there in Mississippi with Phoenix Jackson as she sets out to get the medicine for her grandson, encountering the thorny bush, the scarecrow, and the black dog, the young hunter, and the lady along the way. I could just see that pearly cloud of mistletoe. And then Phoenix's little grandson near the end. She said, he got a sweet look. He going to last. He wear a little patch quilt and peep out holding his mouth open like a little bird. I sat stunned when it was over. Miss Welty had seemed perfectly composed as she was reading. Her face was luminous, lit from within. Now, having finished, she looked nearly shy, though her huge blue eyes were shining. Well, she said, looking around, any questions? Hands waved everywhere. She chose the young man who seemed the most impassioned. Knowing what I know now, I bet anything his dissertation was riding on his question. He leapt to his feet to ask it. I wonder, he said, his dark curly hair going everywhere, if you could comment upon your choice of marble cake as a symbol of the fusion between dream and reality, between the temporal and the eternal, the male and the female, the union of yin and yang. He made these yin-yang sort of motions with his hands. Miss Welty smiled sweetly at him. Well, she said slowly, considering, it's a lovely cake, and it's a recipe that has been in my family for years. Marble cake? My own mother made the best marble cake in town. It would be years, of course, before I would understand that exchange and what really took place in our classroom that day. Later, in the final section of one writer's beginnings, Miss Welty would put it best when she said that the outside world is the vital component of my inner life. My work, in the terms in which I can see it, is as dearly matched to the world as its secret sharer. My imagination takes its strength and guides its direction from what I see and hear and feel and remember of my living world. Immediately after Miss Welty's visit, I read everything she had ever written. And it was like that proverbial light bulb clicked on in my head. Suddenly, I knew what I knew. Of course, with the awful arrogance of the 19-year-old, I decided that Eudora Welty hadn't been anywhere much either. And yet, she wrote the best stories I'd ever read. Plain stories about country people and small towns, my own living world. I sat down and wrote a little story myself about 3 women sitting on a porch drinking iced tea and talking interminably about whether one of them really did need a hysterectomy or not. I got an A on it. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, we have a little bit of time for questions about anything at all that you might possibly like to ask.
It's really just a question about, I was stunned that your mother worked after she married. How was that possible?
Well, she was a home economics teacher and a teacher at the high school.
But I thought, once you got married, you had to give that up.
Well, they could not afford it otherwise. But the minute my father actually started making some money, he made her quit teaching.
Of course.
And she loved it, and she loved the interchange, with the kids and everybody. But he made her quit teaching. And I asked her later, because she suffered from depression in her later years, and she said, I wish I could have continued teaching. And I said, well, why didn't you? And she said, well, your daddy thought it didn't look good in the town. That as soon as he was obviously doing well, you should not teach. And so she did the Girl Scouts and all these different things, but it wasn't the same, I think, for her. Okay. Other question? Somebody over here? Yes. Yes. I love the World Weekly News. I still read all that stuff. I just loved it. Yes, absolutely. Uh-huh.
You didn't mention siblings. Were you an only child?
I was an only child. And actually, I was an only child born very late in life to my parents, who adored each other, but had been told, late in life meaning 40, at that time in 1944. So, but they had been told they could never have children. And so when I was born, I was like this. And so I was spoiled rotten. And I think if I had told my parents, for instance, that when I grew up I wanted to be an axe murderer, they would have bought me the axe. I really believe it. But instead, I loved writing. And so Daddy built me these little writing houses on the riverbank. And every time it flooded, he'd build it back and, and so on. So I had a lot of encouragement from them. I always wanted sisters, though, and so every time I write a book, I have way too many people in it still, I think. It's because of all those sisters. But anything else? Yes. Sure. So this question, in case you couldn't hear, is about Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, which I imagine most of you have read. And and my comment on that, I think it's wonderful that it's a bestseller, because I think it has shown a whole lot of people what other kinds of lives are really like. He's a great writer, and I think his depiction of his own family and his own upbringing has been really important, I think. And I'm glad particularly that attention is focused on my region and the needs, which are so enormous, that we have. I have a few bones to pick with him. One is that he sort of blames the victim, I think, in a certain way, at least a little bit too much for me, because not everybody is as brilliant as he is or has that empowering mama and is able to raise themselves up by their bootstraps and go to Harvard, okay? Not everybody is able to do that, and we need many, many more kinds of services there than we have. So there's that. And then there's also, he never, ever, ever mentions what the big coal companies have done to that region. He never mentions it, and yet he grew up in Eastern Kentucky, as well as Ohio, and that I cannot. It's unconscionable, what they have done. So there's that, and but now, since he's made so much money, J.D. Vance has quit working with his Republican think tank where he used to be, and he's moved back to Ohio, and he has started a huge foundation for opioid abuse. And his mother is still on heroin even right now at this moment. So this is really important, and this is the kind of thing I never saw any sign of. And I, and I think he's going to run for office, and I'm glad he is. I don't care if he's a Republican. I'm glad he is. So, and he may not be. Who knows? But I do think it's great that he's moved back and is putting some of his money in this place. So, yeah. Yes.
Lee, the first book I read of yours was Oral History, which goes back a while.
Yeah.
Can you talk? It was an interesting book. It's hard to get into, partly because of the language, the way you construct it from the narrator's point of view. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
As far as your autobiography or where it came from.
Yeah. No. This is a question about my novel, Oral History, and I had been, that's where I grew up, and I had spent many, many years, every time I would go back, taping my relatives. I was really taping my Aunt Kate because I thought she was so old. And, then she lived to be 109. So there was no rush. But, all these people, she was hilarious because apparently if you turn 100 and you make a call to the office of the president, then the president of the United States will call you on your birthday. One time I went over to see Aunt Kate when she was 106. And I said, well, how are you today? And she said, not too well. And I said, well, what's the matter? And she said, that goddamn George Bush just called me on the phone. So, but anyway, I spent years and years taping Aunt Kate and everybody else I knew and everybody else in the county. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it, but I could see the minute those first big TV dishes went up on the mountainsides that it was my huge fear that everybody was going to sound like Katie Couric. No problem. Nobody sounds like Katie Couric. I mean, this is a very embedded culture, despite a lot of things. So anyway, but I was taping it. I was interested in the music. I was interested in the history. I was interested in the families and everything. And I was trying to think of a novel that I could put this stuff into, particularly because I was afraid that we would lose the language. As I said, I thought everybody would sound like Katie Couric. But so I was particularly taking notes on all the phrases, that I thought they were poetic, they were beautiful. I mean, just saying, for instance, that so-and-so, some man has daddied more babies than anybody in the county. Or saying that a creek, that comes down the mountain, turkey tails into the bottom, or just whatever. So I was taking notes on all this. And then I finally tried to write a novel where I could really use the language, a novel that would, go way back in time and allow me to use it before it was gone. Because it is pretty much gone, So I wrote Oral History, which is a novel that starts in 1900, so I could do the math. Okay, so I know when the Depression starts, and whatever. And it goes 100 years, and it's one family in one holler that's cursed by a witch, and it kind of goes from down, to the generations. But that was my big aim, was to use the language, and I did. And now, I understand it's also sort of an impediment because, it's kind of hard to read. Maybe if I were doing it right now, I wouldn't go quite as heavy on it. I don't know. I'm very proud of it, though. So, okay. Yes. One more.
Hi, I was wondering if you'd go back to a moment in your opening comments to us where you
To do
reflected
what?
on writing nonfiction, and
Yes.
you asked yourself and you asked us, well, how can you tell what's fiction and what's nonfiction?
I'm sorry.
I'm hoping that you'll go back to a moment that you were reflecting on in
Yeah.
your comments to us about writing nonfiction and wondering how you can tell the difference
Oh, my
between
God.
fiction and nonfiction. And I would love for you to reflect from that boundary line between the two.
Well, nonfiction to me, as I say, I like stories. I like to make them up, And nonfiction to me was absolutely terrifying because I would write a sentence and I would say, well, is that true? And I didn't know. So at one point during the writing of this book, I had a family reunion since they'd torn up our whole town for, since if you read this book, you'll see why. They tore up this whole town for a flood control project. And so on, our whole town is a Walmart now. But anyway, so since they'd torn up our town, I had a family reunion of my 42 cousins in Hillsboro. And I just wanted to ask them all different things, and they all wanted to talk. And this was right when I was in the middle of the book. And I would ask them all about something. Well, everybody would have a completely different story. I said, remember we had to go to grandmother's house for all those meals. What did you think about that? And some said, oh, she was lovely. She was just a saint. And my cousin Melissa said, she was a bitch out of hell. And so, it's just like, it was just astonishing. And so finally, I began to realize that even as a nonfiction writer, I could write what I thought. It would be okay if I wrote what I thought. And, I didn't have to worry so much. If I honestly felt it and believed it, I could write it so I could finish writing this book. So, but it's a big difference. It has to be true, or at least as true as you can think it. Fiction is much more comforting, because even if you're writing historical fiction or something, you can kind of, there's certain facts, but you can sort of start at a certain place and do this and do that. And, I've written a lot of historical fiction too, but it's just comforting to be able to emphasize certain things to prove your points, and make the story work. And fiction is so much easier, I have to say. And I think there's a way, therefore, in which I can tell the truth better in fiction than nonfiction, because I know what I want to say, and I can make the story go sort of to make my point, I think. I might write some more nonfiction, but I don't know. Yes.
Favorite book?
That I've written or that I just read? Oral history was one that he mentioned was one of my favorites, because it was the first time I got to use the language that I had grown up hearing, and Fair and Tender Ladies is another one, the same kind of thing. But then I don't know, it's always whatever you're working on now, but I had forever wanted to write about Zelda Fitzgerald, and the time that she spent in North Carolina in the mental hospital there. And that's my book, Guests on Earth. And finally, I was so happy when I, saw the time to do that and grab that story, because that's a very important story to me. Yes.
Do you find that when you start a story, the characters in them, do you map it out and you kind of know where they're going? Or do you find that as you go, the characters start to take on a life of their own, and they start to digress and go down little side roads, and you have to pull them back in to fit back into your story?
Well, they are so likely to do that I do write down, I have I'm still writing longhand. That's how I write. And I'm writing on yellow pads, and I have many yellow pads full of everything that's going to happen in this book. But I know that as soon as I start writing, the characters will take on a life of their own. And sometimes you're just astonished at what they're going to do. And I think, I would never do that. Often that's what I think. But I have this feeling that the bureau drawers, the dresser drawers of America are filled with unfinished novels. And so I do try to at least sketch out in some way, think through the book before I start, because I feel like there's this point when you're in the middle of a novel when you just panic and you think, oh my God, what am I doing? This is awful, and I haven't done all these things I should have done. I'm just writing this novel. It's a terrible novel, and blah, blah, blah. It's really hard to go on. But if you do have some sort of a plan, something sketched out, I think of it as pre-writing. I just kind of do 4 or 5 yellow pads of everything that maybe might happen in this book all the way through, so that maybe I might finish it, So everybody's got their own way.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for a 15-minute conversation that we had about 30 some odd years ago that I'm sure you don't remember, but I think changed my life.
What did we say? What do we say?
We were talking about dogs. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail with my dog, and I just come down off the mountain near Hollins, and a professor took me home to her house, and we had a delightful meal, and that was one of the conversations I remembered, but that wasn't with you. But here, that was somewhat later with my dog in front of Wellspring in Durham, sitting on a wooden bench outside with my dog, and it was a horrible August day, and sweat was dripping down my face, and I was trying to keep my dog cool by pouring water on it. We were sitting out there, and I had just come here, and I thought, this is not the place for me. Durham is not a good town. But you sat down next to me on that bench, and we talked dogs, and we talked about Durham, we talked about hair. It was only 15 minutes, but I thought, if that delightful, wonderful woman lives in a place like Durham, North Carolina, maybe this is an okay town. And so here I am all these years later.
Oh, I'm so glad. You could have got me on a bad day. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.